Maggie is the starter trapper character in Evolve, and I could not recommend a better character for new Evolve players to try and main first than Maggie. And that's because Maggie is a character that is both extremely easy to play, at least to a satisfactory standard, but also a character with a surprisingly high skill ceiling if you want to truly master her. And that makes her so perfect for beginners, unlike a lot of other beginner-friendly characters which can become obsolete once you get to higher skill levels. Now, as I said earlier, Maggie is the starter trapper in Evolve, and trappers are a unique role in Evolve, arguably the most important member of the team, which could easily have made them very pressuring for new players to go for. Of course, trappers are both responsible for finding the monster using their tracking abilities, and more importantly, trapping the monster in the mobile arena once they find it. The mobile arena is the single most important ability in Evolve, and in Legacy Evolve, it is the signature ability of the trappers, meaning that only your trapper is capable of forcing the monster into a fight by dropping the dome on them. If your trapper never uses this ability to dome the monster, you're basically guaranteed to be forced to fight a stage 3 monster who has basically full health. Thankfully, doing your job well enough to get by on Maggie is very easy, and so she's actually not too hard for new players to pick up, despite being such an important role for the team. The basic rundown of her abilities would be that she wields an SMG for a main weapon, can plant up to 3 harpoon traps to catch the monster, and tracks the monster using her secret weapon, Daisy. Daisy is Maggie's pet trapjaw. And if you're wondering what a trapjaw is, then it's probably best described as part dog, part shark, part porcupine creatures that like to fight in packs. But to Daisy, we are her pack. Aww. Daisy acts like a 5th player in almost every way. She may not be able to fight the monster, but she has her own health bar. She can go down and be revived like any other teammate, and most importantly, she even has the ability to revive other teammates. As well as that, if all of your teammates are dead but Daisy is still alive, the game isn't over yet until the monster kills Daisy. And considering that whenever a teammate does die, if the monster doesn't win in the next 2 minutes, they come back, that means that sometimes Daisy can clutch up for the entire team. However, of course, all of this is extras. The main purpose of Daisy is to track the monster. Daisy follows the scent of the monster to track it, and tracking the monster as Maggie for a newer player is as simple as following Daisy until he leads you right to it. So, for these newer players, just follow Daisy, dome the monster, and fire on it with your SMG, occasionally dropping down a trap when you have nothing better to do. That will literally be all you have to do to play Maggie at a basic level. But of course, that alone is only enough to get by to start. The more skilled the monsters get, the more you'll have to learn how to actually play Maggie effectively, rather than just do the bare minimum. So now that I've given you the basic rundown, how about we have a bit of a more advanced look into the 3 abilities again. First, let's start with the SMG, since that's probably the quickest one to get through. Maggie's SMG deals serviceable damage at medium to short range. The high fire rate of just over 10 bullets a second makes it spread aggressively and not fire very accurately. But thankfully, you can ADS this weapon, and that does reduce the spread. And if you're unfamiliar with that word, ADS just means aim down sights. When you do ADS with Maggie, you can definitely fire at longer ranges, although still you don't want to be firing at long range ideally. It deals 16.7 damage per shot, has 30 bullets in a clip, and a relatively short 1.75 second reload time. So there's not much to learn about using the SMG overall, just keep your effective range in mind, go for headshots when possible, and of course, try not to miss. That being said, I do have a general tip for high spread weapons as a whole in games like this, which would be to not imagine where you're aiming as a single point on the screen, but rather as a wider circle where you want as much of your target filling that circle as possible. Since your SMG has such high spread, at longer ranges you may line up a perfect shot, but because of the spread from the weapon, the bullet may randomly veer a little bit to the left, right, up or down. And so, when you're firing a whole bunch of shots, you're going to be getting a spray in a circle rather than a straight line. So sometimes you can find yourself trying to line up a headshot and actually dealing less damage than you would have gotten just for going with a body shot. Because when going for this headshot, while the head is in the center of the circle, a lot of those bullets are just going to fire to the left or to the right or above of it. And so you won't land that many headshots, and a lot of your shots will just flat out miss. Whereas here, if we just aim for the body, yeah, we're not getting any headshots, but every bullet will land. So a lot of the times, that can be more effective. Moving on to Daisy, well, Daisy is of course simple to use. but there's still a lot of value in understanding the strengths and shortcomings she brings to the table. You see, Daisy's very powerful for countering stealthy monsters, while some trappers like Crow, Jack, or Griffin may be completely useless when it comes to finding a sneaking monster if they leave absolutely no clues to their position to go off of. Daisy already knows which direction to go at all times, so you'll never be completely lost. No matter how sneaky that monster is, Daisy will always know the right way to go. Now that might sound kind of overpowered, but here's the catch. The downside to this is that Daisy is unfortunately not necessarily smart about her pathfinding. She will find a path to the monster, but she just won't necessarily find the fastest or shortest path to the monster. And any competent monster will generally be capable of outrunning the hunters. The hunters have to use their abilities and positioning to entrap or surprise the monster to catch them. So if you just follow the monster in a straight line all game because you're following Daisy, then you might be able to stay on its tail, but you'll very, very rarely be able to catch up with them unless they outright make a mistake. You'll have to learn when you've gained enough information on where the monster may be by following Daisy, when it is you want to go off on your own and trust your own intuition to plan to cut them off. As well as that, to avoid getting confused, you'll have to learn how to identify if Daisy is following the monster or only trying to follow you. It can help to know that when Daisy howls, it means she wants Maggie to regroup with her to go chase the monster. If you begin following her, then she will be chasing the monster, but if she starts moving again but you never group back up with her, then she's probably just trying to chase after you to regroup with you. I know this sounds stupid, but trust me, you do not want to be that guy who spends half the match going the wrong direction because they think Daisy's chasing the monster when Daisy's just trying to follow Maggie. But you might notice most of what I've said so far for this advanced section isn't all that deep. I mean, it's extra stuff to know that's helpful, but nothing all that crazy, and I said that this character has a surprisingly high skill ceiling. Well, the main reason I said that is because the biggest source of their skill expression, I feel, comes through harpoon traps. When I mentioned earlier that Maggie is a character I considered to have a surprisingly high skill ceiling, harpoon traps were the main reason why. Because to beginners, harpoon traps at first seem like they're a pretty minor part of Maggie's kit. It mainly feels like something that is there just so you have something to do when you have nothing better to do, since you can set them up whenever you want. However, to an experienced Maggie, these traps are quite possibly the most powerful tool in your arsenal. Harpoons deal minor damage to the monster when they attach, they apply a minor slow to the monster, which also affects their climb speed as well as their movement speed, and most importantly, they completely prevent the monster from leaving their range until they are broken. They break in one direct hit from the monster, or if they've already gone off, the monster can simply swipe in the direction of the harpoon trap to break it off, even if they're not close enough to touch the trap itself. The monster also can see your traps through walls by smelling and seeing their red outline. However, most of the time that doesn't really help them that much because they are tiny and they usually have other more important things to focus on, so you will usually still be able to catch them with the traps pretty easily. They take a total of 5 seconds to arm after you place them down, have a range of 20 meters, and deal 25 damage on impact. They also, I couldn't get an exact number on their reload time, but it is pretty long, so you basically never want to be sitting there just waiting to reload your next harpoon trap. The second you fire one out, just swap back to your SMG and fire a few bullets before you try and drop down another trap. Because of how little it can sometimes feel like these harpoons do, definitely to newer players they seem to be nothing more than a distraction. But the longer you play, the more your skills in placing these things effectively develops, you'll begin to understand and appreciate just how much these things do for you and your team when placed effectively. Ultimately, the monster is faster than the hunters, as I have said, and the monster has access to many attacks which at closer ranges can often simply be undodgeable. Not even a skill issue, just the hitbox of this attack is so huge that there is no way you can dodge it. If the monster does it, and you're not far away from it, you get hit, and that's it. There are some attacks which you can dodge with the jetpack, but even then you have limited fuel with the jetpack, and so if the monster keeps focusing you with attacks like that, eventually you just run out of fuel, and then they're undodgeable too. Because of all this, without CC abilities to restrict the monster's movement, you are guaranteed to take a beating every fight if the monster wants to focus you, regardless of how good your movement mechanics and positioning are. CC abilities stands for crowd control, and I must admit I don't understand why we call it crowd control when it's got nothing to do with AoE damage, but CC abilities in games like this refers to abilities that essentially mess with the opponent's movement or abilities. Usually when we say CC we mean stuns, but it can also mean things that take away movement abilities from the enemy player, or it can mean things that push the enemy player into positions they don't want to be in. Of course, harpoons would be an example of this because it prevents the monster from leaving the range of the harpoons until they turn around and break the traps. So, keeping in mind the movement speed of the monster and the fact that at closer ranges most of its attacks are undodgeable, it becomes very clear that the only real consistent way you can avoid damage in Evolve as a hunter is to position yourself far from the monster, but then the monster simply uses their increased movement speed to get in your face when you don't want them to be there. And so, the only way to prevent that is CC. That is why CC abilities are so important in Evolve, because it is the only thing capable of saving you from a monster who has decided that this teammate must die, and they will use all of their abilities to chase them down, get in their face, and hit them with an attack they couldn't possibly dodge. However, all that said, these traps have long arming times and long reload times, and the fact that they're automatic can actually be a downside too, because it makes them prone to go off at the wrong time when timing is very important for situations like this. So it can feel like an uphill battle trying to get value out of Maggie's harpoons. Now, I definitely have to self-confess, I used to be a lot more confident on Maggie, and in all honesty, since I've come back, I do think I'm a little washed now after so long away from the game. So this may be more of a do as I say, not as I do kind of thing. But that being said, here are some tips on maximizing the value of your harpoon traps. First of all, the simplest tip, of course, is to mostly use harpoon traps while you're waiting to reload your SMG. And of course, vice versa. Use your SMG while waiting to reload your harpoon traps. Second of all, when you dome the monster, it's often best to set up traps first rather than go in guns a-blazing. You do not deal anywhere near as much damage as your assault, and you provide infinitely more value by landing critical harpoons on the monster. And while right now the monster might not be in a position where these harpoons will hit them, it doesn't necessarily mean that in 5 seconds time they might not be in a position where those harpoons are going to be useful. As well as that, because you don't instantly start firing on the monster, it gives the monster less of a good idea of where you are and gives you more time to go off on your own setting up traps, without the monster jumping on you because it's getting shot by you. As a trapper, you really don't want to die and pick a fight with the monster when you don't need to anyway, especially because you're the only person keeping the dome up anyway. So it's not a bad idea to hide when you enter a dome at first. So if you are hiding, you may as well be putting down harpoon traps. Third tip is to consider where you're likely to be fighting from once you've placed a dome down. Obviously, how you should place these traps is going to depend from map to map, but for one example, imagine doming a monster in an area where there are 2 high platforms to fight from, separated by a gap that you can easily get over with your jetpack. You're likely to want to set up on one of these platforms to fight the monster from high ground, and then jump over to the other one if the monster climbs up to attack you. That means ideally you would want to place a trap that would go off only once the monster has climbed up onto that first platform to prevent them from chasing you over to the second platform. And even better would be if you could place a second trap in a position where it would go off when the monster attempts to jump over towards you and will cancel their leap. This may sound simple, but having an idea of what you're going to do and where you're hoping to be with your traps helps you avoid aimlessly spamming them about the battlefield without really any plan for how they're going to be useful. Fourth, try to make sure that when your traps do hit the monster, they hit it from multiple angles. You could hit a monster with 3 harpoons at once, but if they're all coming from the same angle, the monster can free itself in one swipe, and you may as well have just placed one trap. In my experience, the ideal way to harpoon the monster is to have it be hit with 2 traps simultaneously, both at a diagonal angle from behind, with one being more to the left and one being more to the right. Hitting the monster with multiple harpoons stacks the slow effect to choke the monster's movement abilities, and hitting it from 2 different angles from behind forced the monster to first turn around and give up on chasing whoever they were after to destroy the first one, and then painstakingly turn and also remove the second one, going one at a time, with the slow still in effect. If you only hit them with 1 harpoon, while it's still effective, the monster does have the ability to animation cancel their swipe attack to break the trap into an ability to attack one of the hunters to get back into the fight quickly. If you've not heard of animation cancels in video games before, animation cancels is when an attack or some kind of an ability in a video game has an animation, but the effect that you get from that ability is already present before the animation finishes. And so you start doing something else to not have to wait for the whole animation to finish while still getting all of the effect of that ability. You can do this with just about any monster attack in Evolve. Your basic monster swipes in Evolve can easily be cancelled into any of your other abilities. However, you cannot cancel a swipe into another swipe. If you keep pressing swipe, you will still have to wait until your monster has completely finished their swipe animation before they can start the next swipe. So hitting them with 2 harpoons means they can't just break the first one and quickly cancel the animation time that you'd have to wait normally on the first swipe into a rock throw if they're Goliath, for example. Instead, they would have to do 2 swipes, which means at least one of those swipes they'll have to wait the full duration of the animation before they're able to throw a rock at you. By which time, the hunter they were probably attacking is probably miles away and no longer within range. With all that said, while 2 harpoons at once are the ideal in my opinion, you do only have 3 to work with in the first place. So that shouldn't discourage you from using single harpoons whenever pairing 2 together isn't possible for you. 5th tip, if you dome the monster in an area where they have very few feasible escape routes where the dome comes down, that means if you're feeling confident, you can actually choose to not use any traps in the fight, and instead choose to try and set the harpoons up ahead of time at each of the monster's exits to prevent them from escaping when the dome comes down and prolong the fight. Though, keep in mind this play is risky, as it means that you have less protection for you and your team during the fight in the dome, and if the monster finds a way out of that dome that avoids all of your traps, it will have all been for nothing. For the 6th and final tip, here's a very unintuitive but very important tip for using the harpoon traps effectively. Usually, with traps like this that work off of line of sight, you want to place them in areas where they have the clearest shot and the widest area to catch the monster. However, there are many cases with the harpoon trap where this is actually a bad thing to do, and it's the wrong play to place harpoon traps in the open where they can see the most area. The reason being, as we've already demonstrated, good harpoon traps have to go off at the right time from the right angle to be effective. Harpoon traps placed in the center of a path may cover more area, but are rarely a good idea. Not only are they way more obvious for the monster to spot, but more importantly, there's a high chance it'll simply hit the monster from the front, in which case it will barely slow the monster down at all, and it will immediately be destroyed with one quick swipe without the monster even having to turn. However, if we hide the traps in corners, while their area of effect is smaller, they are much more likely to be effective. In this example, the traps may only cover about a quarter of the range compared to before, but they will only go off once the monster is far enough forward that they will be preventing them from moving any further, and the monster will have to stop and turn to destroy them. So essentially, when you want your traps to only go off at a certain time, try to block their vision of any areas where you don't want to harpoon the monster, so they can only see the monster in areas where if the monster is there, it's a good time for them to go off. A perfect example of this is when a Goliath wants to get up onto a high spot to jump away after the end of a fight. If there's a lower platform just below that higher platform, then on that lower platform, hugging the wall of the higher platform is the perfect spot to hide traps. That way, they will only go off if they try to jump off of that higher platform, and that guarantees that if they're set off, they're going to cancel Goliath's jump and potentially completely ruin their escape route. One final note I'd like to make about harpoons is simply an acknowledgement that their effectiveness varies heavily from monster to monster, and that is of course because the best way to use harpoon traps is to counter monsters' movement or to interrupt attacks that force them to move. With that said, it's pretty obvious that they're most effective against the 2 types of Goliath, as they can cancel their leaps, they can cancel their charges, and most importantly, they can cancel their body slams. They're also pretty effective at countering the 2 behemoths with their rolls, and they're pretty good at countering Gorgon's web slings. However, they are less effective against the 2 Krakens. But mostly it's just a range problem. If you do manage to attach a harpoon onto them, it can prevent them from flying away and actually be quite devastating. It can also occasionally mess up their aftershocks. That being said, once again, because they fly, it's very rare that you catch them in a trap. By far, though, your biggest concern would be wraiths, as harpoon traps rarely counter their movements or abilities, making them near useless against the wraith. That being said, thankfully you already have Daisy, which is one of the best counters to any stealthy kind of monster in the game, and of course, Wraith's strength is their stealth. So it's not a hopeless situation by any means. With all that said, that's most of how you play Maggie. But what about her variant, Wasteland Maggie? Well, Wasteland Maggie is kind of like the reverse Blitz Markov. Where Blitz Markov, I would say, is the more skill-demanding version of Markov and the only real viable way to play Markov, Wasteland Maggie is the less skill-demanding version of Maggie, who gives more value for less effort, but overall is probably not the stronger pick. The short way to describe what Wasteland Maggie is Wasteland Maggie is Maggie but with fire on everything. Her SMG now has a fire damage over time effect. Her harpoon trap now is a flame snare, which obviously sets the monster on fire as well as harpooning them. and Daisy even has a flamethrower strapped to her back to attack the monster with. At first, this might seem like a straight upgrade, but of course, it's all too good to be true, isn't it? In fairness, Wasteland Maggie doesn't have that many downgrades in Legacy Evolve. She now only has 1 harpoon trap instead of 3, which reduces a lot of her skill expression. However, that harpoon trap, as well as being able to set the monster on fire, does have massively increased range, which makes it much more effective against the Krakens. As well as that, although her SMG now sets the monster on fire, it's now a burst fire, which in fairness does mean that it's more accurate now, but it also means it fires a lot more slowly, so there's that. In fairness, whether Wasteland Maggie or normal Maggie is better is actually quite tight in Legacy Evolve. Personally, I do think the harpoon traps are kind of slept on, and are way more powerful than people give it credit for once you really learn how to use them effectively, and is some of the best CC in the game. So personally, I would never trade away Maggie. But I can't lie that the only real effective downside of Wasteland Maggie is that lack of 3 harpoon traps, and you do get a lot of upsides to compensate for the loss of that harpoon trap. That being said, it's a much easier call to make when it comes to Stage 2. In Stage 2, normal Maggie is definitely better. And the reason I say that with such conviction is because there are 2 new downsides to Wasteland Maggie in Stage 2. That being that Wasteland Maggie's Daisy can now no longer revive in Stage 2, which is a big downside. And as well as that, original Maggie in Stage 2 got a buff, which made it so Daisy grants a speed boost to people who follow her, which Wasteland Maggie does not get. Overall, Wasteland Maggie is an easier character to play at first, so when you're less confident, feel free to play Wasteland Maggie. That being said, I don't think you'll ever reach the full potential of Maggie if you're stuck playing Wasteland Maggie all the time. Maggie is most effective when she's able to constantly CC the monster with her 3 harpoon traps, and being stuck with only 1 is really ineffective against most monsters, again, except Wraith and Kraken. This is why, while I would generally recommend normal Maggie over Wasteland Maggie, there is one circumstance where I think that Wasteland Maggie can be better, and that is against either a Kraken or a Wraith. I think that she's better against the Kraken or the Wraith, because of course I've already explained how the traps have more range to get the Krakens more easily with the Kraken, but for Wraith it's actually a different reason. It's not even necessarily because you don't need harpoon traps as much against Wraith, although that is true. More importantly, you set Wraith on fire, and one of the most powerful things Wraith can do is turn invisible and send a decoy at you, but the invisibility doesn't work while you're on fire. And my god, I can tell you from experience, because I used to play a lot of Wraith, there was nothing more fucking blood boiling than playing half a game perfectly stealthy and then getting set on fire once by Wasteland Maggie and never being able to hide again because I'm constantly burning because everything she does sets me on fire, and as long as I'm on fire, I can't be invisible again. God, it is so annoying trying to hide from a Wasteland Maggie if you're a Wraith. Not to mention, both versions of Maggie still have Daisy constantly sniffing me out as Wraith, so yeah, Wasteland Maggie is a real pain in the ass for Wraith to deal with. All that said, those are my opinions on Maggie and Wasteland Maggie. As I say, I generally recommend Maggie more highly, but Wasteland Maggie is certainly easier to play and has some better matchups against specific monsters. Obviously, play whoever you like, but if you like Maggie, then I highly recommend that you make her your main to start. You can change your mind later once you've played the game more if you feel like there's another character you gravitate more towards, but Maggie is a great first character to main because you can get so much value off of her for doing so little, but also you don't necessarily develop bad habits by playing Maggie or end up getting stuck on a character that becomes obsolete at higher skill levels because of the fact that the harpoon traps have such a high skill ceiling to them. With all that said, thank you for watching, and next time I'll be talking about Val.
They're smart. They don't